Hey everybody, welcome to episode 122 of Waking Up to Narcissism. I am your host, Tony Overbay. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. We're going to talk about an article today that bothered me, that got a little bit under my skin, because I think it oversimplifies how to interact with someone that is narcissistic or will go all the way to extreme emotionally immature. So before we get to that article, I do want to set the table with a couple of things. First, because part of what this podcast, my entire Waking Up to Narcissism platform has been built on, is that the term narcissist is often used a little too freely, a little too cavalier these days, because in reality, only a small number of people actually have narcissistic personality disorder. According to the current research, the prevalence of narcissistic personality disorder in the general population is actually pretty low. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, which is what we as clinicians use for diagnostic criteria, estimates that NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, affects up to 6.2% of the general population. More conservative estimates from community samples suggest a lower prevalence. There was a study published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 2008, and they found a lifetime prevalence also of 6.2%, but that was for men and 4.8% for women. And another study in 2010 in Biological Psychiatry reported a prevalence of about 1% in the general population. So I think it's very important to note that these figures are a lot lower than the casual use of the term narcissist probably suggests. But let's talk about emotional immaturity, because I think this is something that we need to talk more about as a society, because emotional immaturity, that refers to a state where an individual's emotional responses and their coping mechanisms aren't fully developed, or they are inappropriate for their age. It's like you are literally interacting with a 10-year-old who is in an adult body. And the hallmark signs of somebody who is emotionally immature are things like they have difficulty managing their emotions, they have difficulty handling stress or empathizing with others, and that can lead to a difficulty of maintaining healthy relationships. And emotionally immature adults, they often react to situations in ways that are more typical of a kid or an adolescent, because they lack that self-awareness, but even more so the emotional regulation skills that are typically expected of grown-ups. So examples of emotional immaturity in adults, there's probably three that I see the most. One is anger management issues, because an emotionally immature adult will throw a tantrum when things don't go their way, let's say at work. For example, if they have an idea that's rejected in a meeting, they might storm out, they might slam doors, they might yell at colleagues because they need to get their way. And that behavior, it mirrors pretty much to a T what a little kid does when they have a meltdown when they don't get the toy that they want. So the emotional immaturity is clear from the inability to handle disappointment constructively, like an adult, like a big boy. And they resort to explosive, disruptive behaviors instead of engaging in dialogue, using their big kid words, and definitely not being able to accept a decision that goes against them very gracefully. So we got anger. I think the second one is the inability to take ownership or accountability or responsibility, because an emotionally immature adult might consistently blame others for their mistakes or their shortcomings. If they forget to pay a bill, they incur a late fee, then they're going to blame the company because they didn't send enough reminders, or that's a stupid way that they charge people anyway. Or they're going to blame their partner for not reminding them. And this is similar to how a kid might blame a sibling for breaking a toy that they actually broke themselves. So the emotional immaturity here lies in the lack of accountability and also the refusal to acknowledge their own role in the situation, their own accountability, taking ownership for what they've done. And it's far easier and less mature to shift that blame because they're going to avoid the discomfort of consequences. And then the third most common form of emotional immaturity that I see is this difficulty with delayed gratification, because an emotionally immature adult will struggle with impulse control. A lot of times, if you look at things like in financial matters, they might max out a credit card and then buy things they can't afford, spend their entire paycheck on things like entertainment or food, and they neglect important bills or savings because they want what they want right now. And that behavior is pretty reminiscent of a kid who immediately spends all their allowance on candy instead of saving for the larger toy they want. Their emotional immaturity is very apparent in their inability to prioritize long-term goals over short-term desires and the lack of self-control in managing resources responsibly. And that is why you do see a lot of emotional immaturity in people that struggle with turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms, like the work I do with people that are turning to pornography as an unhealthy coping mechanism, where often it is an impulse control issue. It's a compulsive behavior. Because in that moment, if they feel bad and they want a quick dopamine release, then they can turn to things like food, a phone, or things like pornography. But I think that these examples show how emotional immaturity in adults often mirrors those childlike behaviors. And the goal is to become more emotionally mature as you go throughout life, as you have different experiences. But when we're stuck in the world of the emotionally immature, now you're going to have people that are using anger to get rid of their discomfort or to have control, or they're going to make impulsive decisions. And then if you put that second part we talked about in there and not take ownership or accountability, but even project that the reason they did the things they did, it's not their fault. It's because of you, something that you did. So instead of labeling everybody as a narcissist, it's more accurate to think about emotional maturity, because we all start out as emotionally immature. It's a normal part of growing up. And as we go through life, we face different situations and we have the chance to become more emotionally mature. Think of emotional immaturity like a long line with the most immature on one end and then the most emotionally mature on the other. Some people might stay closer over to the immature end, showing narcissistic behaviors or traits or tendencies, while other people might be further along the line toward maturity. I think often where we start in that line is a lot based off of how we grew up. What are the types of relationships we saw modeled? Did we see our own parents try to connect with us emotionally, let us learn how to have our feelings? Or did we see parents who were emotionally inconsistent, who didn't take ownership of things, who didn't really explore empathy? But only those at the very extreme end of this immaturity line might actually have narcissistic personality disorder. And I was thinking about what would that line look like personified? And it took me on a little tangent. So growing up with the last name Overbay, I'd say that was definitely an adventure in lining up in alphabetical order. Whenever we had to line up by last name, I found myself comfortably nestled in the middle to the back of the pack. No front row pressure, but also no cool, hey, look at me, I'm at the end of the line bragging rights. Just your average middle of the alphabet guy. And if we lined up in height order, well, let's just say I was definitely more vertically challenged than vertically gifted, and that was not the place that you wanted to be either, is more toward the front of that line. But I do think here's the kicker. If we had lined up by emotional maturity, especially in those elementary or middle school days, I might have actually seen the front of the line for once. Not something to write home about, but I guess you can take it as a win. You got to start somewhere. Now imagine if we actually did line up a bunch of fifth graders by emotional maturity. And I think you might actually see a little bit of a correlation with what we see in adulthood. At the front of the line, you got the kids who are basically little human tornadoes. They're the ones who think sharing means I will share my germs by licking your cookie, or they're pulling pigtails, or making armpit fart noises and starting your mama jokes and verbal battles that usually end in tears, probably their own. These are the kids who still believe in cooties and think the appropriate response to losing at a game of four squares to then take that little red playground ball and just kick it as far as you can, and I'm not going to go pick it up, having a full-on meltdown. Then about 25% of the way back in the line, you got the class clowns, the drama queens, probably the people that I thought were the cool kids, because there I am at the front of the line. You know, they're not quite as chaotic as the frontliners. They don't need a leash when their parents take them to Disneyland, but they're still working on that whole inside voice concept. You know, these are the kids who will do anything for attention. They'll eat bugs, boogers, dirt, chalk, anything on a dare, or pretend to faint during math class so they can get out of things. And in the middle of the pack, we've got your average fifth grader. They're starting to figure out that maybe, just maybe, the world doesn't revolve around them. They might actually share their snacks without being forced to, and they mastered the art of the slight eye roll when the teacher assigns homework instead of the audible, oh, come on, are you kidding me? And then moving about 75% of the way back through the line, here's where the sweet spot is, the more mature territory. These kids are probably the peacekeepers, the ones who might actually listen during conflict resolution lessons. They're trying to pay attention. They're taking ownership of the things that they say and do. And they're starting to show little signs of empathy, like maybe comforting a friend when they skin their knee instead of laughing and yelling fail, or then one-upping that person and talking about a time where they skinned their knee way worse. But then at the very back of the line, we got the old souls. These are the kids who make adults say, oh, they are so mature for their age. But here's the thing. While it might sound cool to be called an old soul in fifth grade, it really isn't that glamorous, because these kids at the end of the line, they are the ones who've had to grow up way too fast. They're probably packing their own lunches, helping younger siblings with homework, packing younger siblings' lunches, dealing with adult-sized problems, forging the notes of parent-teacher conference, while then the classmates all the way up at the front of the line are arguing over who gets to be the line leader. Take one of my clients, for example. This is based on a very true story. She said, picture a 12-year-old girl, hair up in curlers like a mini housewife from the 50s, already smoking cigarettes like she's auditioning for a gritty reboot of the Beverly Hillbillies, and she's cruising down a rural southern road in an Oldsmobile Cutlass that's probably older than she is at the time, off to buy groceries for her mom, who just wasn't able to really show up. And then the cherry on top, getting hit on by a store clerk who thinks that she's in her mid-20s. Talk about a childhood that went from 0 to 60 faster than that Oldsmobile Cutlass ever could. So while being at the back of this emotional immaturity line might seem like a good thing, sometimes it's better to try to find yourself somewhere more toward the middle and enjoy being a kid while you can. Because after all, adulting is a little bit overrated, especially when you're still young enough inside at heart where you still believe the 5-second rule might actually be a thing. And then that game show where you pretend that the ground is full of hot lava, you notice that some people are really good at that because I think that they still pretend that when they're on their own. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about an article that was brought to my attention from an email by a listener that asked me my opinion on a quote about using empathy to break through to the narcissist. And my initial thoughts were, I don't even understand how those aren't used together, empathy and breakthrough and narcissist. Let me first start by reading the email, and then we're going to dive deep into this article. And this is one of those where please get a pen and paper handy, I guess if you're over the age of 40, and if not, take some notes on your phone or your computer, because I would love your thoughts and any experiences that you've had that come up for you while you hear today's episode. Here's the email that I received from a listener. Dear Tony, I read the following quote, but I can't quite understand how I can use empathy to reach my narcissistic spouse. It makes no sense because I am the one who has empathy. He doesn't appear to have any at all. She said, I'm sorry, but I don't remember where I got the quote or I would cite it here, but please help me wrap my head around this tactic. Here's the quote. Now, the funny thing is my first thought, I think it was at the great Carly Simon who said, he's so vain he probably thinks this song is about you. And my first read of this was, wait, is this something I said? I don't remember saying this because that sounds pretty insane. But it turns out that it wasn't me, and she did email me later and say she found the article that contained the quote, and that's the article that we'll be using as our muse for this episode. But the quote says, if there is one way you can reach the mind of a narcissist, it's by empathy. You don't have to call them out or expose them. Instead, an empathetic confrontation is an effective way to get a narcissist to listen to you and is often used by therapists to treat people with narcissistic tendencies. Develop a deep understanding of why they think a specific way and use this information to confront them about their behavior. Over a period, the narcissist may become receptive and obliged to visit a therapist or a counselor for further treatment. I could spend a podcast episode on that very quote alone, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into the actual article itself. But if I had to do a quick run through, though, is saying if there is one way you can reach the mind of a narcissist is by empathy, I disagree right out of the gate. Instead, an empathetic confrontation is an effective way to get a narcissist to listen. Confrontation is the wrong idea in general, and an empathetic confrontation is more of a way to show them what really matters to you and give them buttons that they can push later. But I really take exception with the part that says is often used by therapists to treat people with narcissistic tendencies. As a therapist who works with people with narcissistic traits and tendencies, trying to have an empathetic confrontation with them has not ever been part of the treatment plan. And I will make the case that I really feel like it can actually do far more harm than good, and that's what concerns me about articles like this. I want to emphasize that while empathy is generally a positive trait, I am pro-empathy, but it needs to be balanced with self-protection when you're dealing with somebody that has narcissistic traits and tendencies or is incredibly emotionally immature. And I would love to tackle some strategies today to recognize when empathy is being exploited, and we'll talk about how to set healthy boundaries without completely losing your own compassionate nature or sense of self. And then while you are here, do me a favor, go to tonyoverbay.com, sign up for my newsletter, and please follow me on social media, on Instagram at virtual.couch and on TikTok at virtualcouch. And please find the Virtual Couch YouTube channel, and I would love it. It would be an absolute honor if you would subscribe and like and hit the buttons and all those other things that one does. And I would say in particular, though, follow me on Instagram and TikTok and watch for the live relationship question and answers that I do with my daughters, Mackie and Sydney. We typically do them on Sunday nights, but we'll also try to find another time during the week. And it is fascinating to get their insight. And the dynamic of the audience, the interactions, the questions, that group that comes together on those lives is pretty amazing. And if you have questions that you would love answered, please send them in to contact@tonyoverbay.com, and I will try to answer those either on the question and answer sessions, and those get turned into the shorts and the reels, but I would just love to have you be a part of that community. Let's move on to this article. So the title is, What is Disarming a Narcissist? 12 Simple Ways to Do So, and I recognize I am going to sound a bit dramatic because I'm about to get on my soapbox about the title alone. Because what is Disarming a Narcissist? 12 Simple Ways to Do So, and I will have the link to the article in the show notes. But the article can be found on a site called momjunction.com. And then it has a checkbox that says research backed. And then it is reviewed by a Nora Tolinar-Sanso, who MSc, EFT, written by, I'm going to butcher a lot of names, my apologies, but to Shikha Thakur, who has an MBA, edited by Siddharth Kisaraju, MA, certification in relationship coaching, fact-checked by Apruva K, MSc, counseling psychology, and then this was last updated September 12th, 2024. So we jump into the title. What is Disarming a Narcissist? 12 Simple Ways to Do So. I feel like that underestimates the complexity of a narcissistic relationship. Someone who is in a relationship with someone who has narcissistic traits and tendencies or on the spectrum of emotional immaturity. And so for the sake of moving forward in today's podcast, I will just use the term narcissist, but I'm talking about someone who has narcissistic traits and tendencies or who is extremely emotionally immature all the way up to the person with narcissistic personality disorder. But describing ways to disarm a narcissist is simple, grossly underestimates the complexity of narcissistic personality traits and behaviors. Narcissism, especially when it reaches the level of a personality disorder, as this is just simply talking about narcissism in the article, is a deeply ingrained pattern of thoughts, of feelings, of behaviors that are anything but simple to address or to change, because this is a pattern of behavior that has happened since childhood. It also creates these false expectations because I think the word simple sets a very unrealistic expectation for the reader because it suggests that managing interactions with a narcissist is pretty easy, straightforward. It's research-backed. It can lead to frustration. It can lead to self-blame. And that's when these, quote, simple methods don't work as expected because the person that is in these relationships is a pathologically kind person. They are a person that is, kindness is a good trait, but it is pathologized. It is to their detriment. And the person that is seeking out articles like this, or if you're listening to this podcast, no doubt you have been on a pursuit of truth and knowledge because you want to fix the relationship, and it has most likely been put on you. And now you're finding this article that says, here's a simple method. So if it doesn't work because it is not simple, then I worry that the person that is trying these things is going to feel like something is completely wrong with me. I am a bad person because I cannot even now implement these simple methods to change my narcissistic partner or make the relationship better. Because it's an oversimplification of relationships. Relationships with narcissists, whether personal or let's talk about professional, they are intricate. They are multifaceted. And so labeling a solution as simple dismisses the nuance, the dynamics that are at play here, and the emotional toll that these relationships take. And it really does promote basically a disregard, I think, for individual differences because narcissism, as we've identified, exists on a spectrum. And what each narcissistic individual does is unique. There are so many subtypes of narcissism. So what might even work in one situation could be ineffective or counterproductive in another. So I go back to this term simple because it implies a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't account for all of these individual differences. And I really feel like there's a potential for harm, because suggesting that dealing with a narcissist is simple can lead people to underestimate the potential for emotional or psychological harm and abuse in these interactions. There are people that I work with on a regular basis experiencing such intense symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder that it is hard for them to stay emotionally regulated. Calling it simple and providing you with tools that I believe will actually further expand the attack surface can result in somebody staying in an abusive situation longer than they should, thinking that they just need to apply these simple solutions more effectively. Because I think that minimizes the victim's experience. For those who have dealt with narcissistic abuse, seeing their complex, often traumatic experiences reduced to something that can be solved with simple steps, that is invalidating, it's dismissive, and it can make that person feel even worse about themselves. And I think it creates an overall lack of professional consideration, because if you are dealing with severe narcissism, that requires intervention, professional intervention. And I go back to this word simple. It might discourage people actually from seeking necessary professional help, thinking they should be able to figure out how to interact with the narcissist and handle the situation on their own. And the truth is, this is just an overall misrepresentation of the entire recovery process. Because people that are trying to navigate in or out of relationships with narcissists, the process of setting boundaries, of healing, of potentially leaving the relationship, of having their kids and family triangulated against them, of dealing with the years of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very real thing. And when somebody is experiencing this extreme emotional distress, that is what is part of being in a relationship, a trauma bond. The trauma bond alone is a form of what is known as intermittent reinforcement, where the person who has been delivering the emotional and sometimes physical, financial, spiritual punishment then is also the person that delivers the reward to this person. And that has been a pattern that has been happening for years, if not decades, in a relationship with a narcissistic person. And it affects the same areas of the brain as does someone who has a drug addiction. So there are symptoms of withdrawal. So telling the person to just simply stop taking the drug, it's pretty easy. Just talk to the person reasonably. The person who is delivering that intermittent reinforcement. And back to the complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what the research shows there is that there is a challenge in keeping things in short-term memory, because you've got this heightened fight or flight state that has been going on for so long that you've got this trauma. The body keeps the score. The neurons that fire together over time wire together, and your baseline stress level, your baseline cortisol levels are at an all-time high. What it feels like to be you as somebody that is continually in this state of, what is wrong with me? I have to figure it out. I have to manage his emotions and the family's emotions, or her emotions if she's the narcissistic person. And so your poor little brain has now started sending all the blood flow to the amygdala, to the fight or flight part of the brain, and it just bypasses this hippocampus, this area where short-term memory is held. And if things are not making their way into short-term memory, they're definitely not going to make their way into long-term memory. The concept of just simply communicating. We'll get to this a little bit later, but in this article, there's a graphic, and it talks about ways to communicate with the narcissist. And maybe as a nice way for me to gather myself, let me bring that graphic up now. The right phrases when talking to a narcissist. And it's an adorable graphic, I'll give the artist credit. But here are the things, the right phrases. So right, wrong, absolutes, black and white. The right phrases when talking to a narcissist. Here's the things they say. We both have the right to our own opinions. If you are in a relationship with a narcissistic person or somebody who's extremely emotionally immature, how is that going to go over? Oh, you think you have the right to your own opinion. Oh, so all of a sudden I got the person with their PhD here, and now I have to listen to you? Or, I hear what you're saying, but I think it's best to follow my idea. It's funny, that's my own emotional immaturity that is starting to feel like I must speak very loudly and use my hands to show you how serious I am. But these phrases, I hear what you're saying, but I think it's best to follow my idea, says the pathologically kind person to the narcissist. Or, I refuse to argue with you anymore. Or, I'm disappointed in you and your behavior. And I think I just want to continually go back to this phrase of, if you are in a relationship with somebody immature or narcissistic, just think of how these will go over when you say this to your narcissistic partner. Or, I won't engage with you anymore if you cannot be respectful. You literally just handed them the button that they know that being disrespectful is the way to get you to engage. That is the attack surface that they need. When the emotionally mature or narcissistic person does not really know how they feel, now they need you to interact with them. You can say something so they can now put you in the one down position. When you are saying things like, I won't engage with you anymore if you cannot be respectful, you will hear about that for a long time to come. Or, I'm not responsible for your anger. that phrase, I can only imagine, would be met by the narcissist of, yeah, you're not responsible for much of anything around here. Do you know all the things that I do? And I never even hear you give me credit for this. And now you're not responsible for my anger? Well, okay, fine. I'm not responsible for paying for your expenses. Or there's another one that says, yes, I'm ready to listen because your opinions are as important as mine. Now that one might go over okay. Well, I will say that one will. Or the other one, I won't allow you to talk to me like that. Again, thinking of how that would go over communicating with a narcissist, I think that these phrases alone are detrimental, damaging, and they're going to give the narcissist far more of an attack surface to work with, and will be things that will be brought up over and over again. And so let's also briefly address the concept of the narcissistic supply, because I do believe that as we go through the 12 simple tips, that if you keep in mind that what the narcissist is looking for is their supply. It is what they need to exist or to know who they are, because the narcissist operates from this false sense of self. So the narcissistic supply refers to the attention, the admiration, the emotional reactions that narcissists crave to maintain their inflated self-image. And this includes both positive and negative attention. It is just any interaction with the narcissist. So when you argue with them, you're inadvertently providing them with the emotional engagement that they seek. Again, even if it's negative. So this reinforces their behavior. It'll make them feel important or powerful regardless of the argument's content. If you haven't heard the episode already, please go back to the last episode of Waking Up to Narcissism and listen to the information about the attack surface, because the narcissist just needs you to provide them with a surface of words that they can then attack, to then know how to put you in that one down position, that they can take that one up position, and now they feel better and they can move on about their day, finding their next supply, and you are left decimated, denigrated, and just feeling like, what is wrong with me? I need to go figure this out. The article starts with, narcissists are self-absorbed, self-involved so much that they ignore others' feelings. If you know someone, you need to learn how to disarm a narcissist to tackle their manipulative strategies effectively. It's difficult to understand their intentions, as sometimes they look so charming with their phony behavior and sweet words, but then they start to showcase their boastful attitude and inflated self-esteem. They can even manipulate you and make you say yes when you want to say no. It's wise to keep a distance from someone who exhibits narcissistic tendencies, as they could disregard your feelings and could also hurt you. So there are some, as one person in the private women's Facebook group said, there are some nuggets in here. There are some things that are based on truth. I think part of the problem is that when you're talking about interacting with this population of people, that it can be really harmful to have some of the information correct. They say, keep reading this post as we bring you some effective ways of disarming a narcissist. I just have such a struggle with that word of disarming. They say, remember to protect yourself by not trying all the methods together, so apparently not doing all 12 of them at once, as the narcissist may become suspicious of your intentions. And I think it's almost this feeling that this person's trying to convey that you can just interact, and if you cross the line and use 3 or 4 of these things, now they're on to you. Now they might do something nefarious. But if you are interacting with a narcissistic person, they truly lack empathy. And narcissism is a childhood coping mechanism for not feeling understood or not feeling seen as a kid, of feeling this intense fear of abandonment, these deep insecurities that have been programmed into them from childhood. It is a childhood defense mechanism. Gaslighting is a childhood defense mechanism. These are things where they cannot tolerate a feeling that they are doing anything wrong or that they are in trouble, and they feel like control is the way that you maintain a relationship. Love or control, not both in an adult relationship. So this isn't something that if you happen to cross this mystical line, now all of a sudden their narcissism kicks in. It is there. The emotional immaturity and narcissistic traits and tendencies up to full-blown narcissistic personality disorder is the air that they breathe, unless they are doing some serious work to self-confront and grow and change. But it's not something where you get 2 or 3 of these going at one time, these simple steps to disarm the narcissist. But if you cross that mystical 4th simple tactic, and now all of a sudden the narcissism kicks in, and oh, you've really done it now, you better disarm them. So then they say, what is disarming a narcissist? We cannot control or neutralize an individual's narcissistic behavior. Therefore, we must be able to spot them and disarm them to protect ourselves from being hurt. Disarming a narcissist involves actions to protect you from the person's narcissism, as if it's some sort of maybe a shield. and might also help tone it down a bit, which it's actually the opposite, that the more you try to disarm them and interact with them, it is going to enhance the narcissistic behavior. They say it's necessary to plan an exit if you find yourself in such a situation. So it's almost as if the assumption is that you're just going about your relationship. You've been in it, something maybe I'm not sure what's going on here, and then let me try to disarm this narcissist. But if I start to really notice this narcissism, then I think I better leave. As if it were ever that simple to even understand or to escape from if you are in that trauma bonded situation. But let's get to the 12 tips to disarm a narcissist. The first one they say is to keep your cool. If you know a narcissist, you know how much they love to fight. And if you're working with a covert narcissist, it's not even as much of they love to fight. They love to take that one-up position and do so in any way possible. So they say keep your cool and don't press the argue button. Now, where I struggle with that is while keeping your cool, while staying calm is generally good advice, it may not disarm the narcissist. They will often interpret your calmness as indifference or a challenge, which can potentially escalate their behavior to provoke the reaction. For example, the narcissist might increase their provocative behavior or accusations if you remain calm, saying things like, see, you don't even care enough to get upset. That is actually the fuel that they need or they desire. Now, do you learn to set healthy boundaries? Absolutely. The boundary is completely different than the ultimatum. And I feel like there are several parts of the article today that are talking about ultimatums, that I'm going to let you know that this is not okay. The boundary is, if you do this, then I leave, then I walk out of the room, which that in and of itself is really difficult. Next, they say avoid feeding their ego. Again, it sounds wonderful. That advice is sound, but oversimplified, because suddenly withdrawing all praise can lead to what is known as narcissistic rage or increased manipulation tactics. So a narcissist might respond to lack of praise by seeking it elsewhere, and then using that against you. Triangulation, or potentially if you're talking to someone in the workplace who's interacting with a narcissist, now they will do anything they can to now sequester, isolate you, and damage that relationship in your work environment. The next one, don't take responsibility for their actions. While it is crucial not to take blame for the narcissist's actions, simply ignoring them isn't always effective or safe as well. That advice doesn't address the potential for escalation or retaliation. A narcissistic boss might punish an employee who refuses to take blame by assigning impossible tasks or maybe even sabotaging their work. Next is avoiding ultimatums. Again, good advice, but that is where we really need to do some psychoeducational work on what that even looks like, because we need to learn the difference between the ultimatum and the boundary. In that graphic that was talking about the right phrases to say when you're talking to a narcissist, that is laden with ultimatums. The things like, I'm hearing what you're saying, but it's best to follow my idea, or I refuse to argue with you anymore, or I'm disappointed in you and your behavior, or I won't engage with you anymore if you can't be respectful. Those are ultimatums. So the literal, quote, right phrases when talking to a narcissist are ultimatums. The I refuse to argue with anymore is the ultimatum. The boundary is, if you continue to argue with me, then I will remove myself from the situation. And that is a you thing, because you are handing the narcissist buttons when you are using these, what they deem correct phrases in interacting with the narcissist. Ultimatum is showing them exactly what is important to you. The boundary is knowing that if they do this, then it's me. Then I will leave the situation. I will follow through on my boundary, even though they will push that boundary like crazy. Next, they say don't give them negative attention. While avoiding negative attention is important, this advice, I don't believe, truly addresses how to respond when interaction is necessary or when the narcissist is being abusive. So for example, in a co-parenting situation, completely avoiding negative attention might not be possible or in the best interest of the children. This is where learning the steps of differentiation becomes more important. That's why the simplicity of an article like this can be more damaging. I've spent several of the past few episodes talking in various ways about how to become differentiated. And that is how to maintain or hold on to your own autonomy while you're in a relationship with someone who is emotionally immature or narcissistic. And that involves these 4 points of balance where you need to develop your solid but flexible sense of self, not needing external validation. And when you start really digging into what external validation looks like, a lot of things fit in this external validation bucket. And one of the biggest things that I was unaware of early on, and one of the main ways that we seek external validation is needing someone to understand. And while I would love it if this person understands, when I need him, he needs to get it. She needs to understand that this is not okay. That is me needing validation. I know it's not okay. And that is that solid sense of self. The flexible piece is that I am open to feedback, but not feedback that someone is telling me what I am thinking or what I am feeling. And then that leads to the second point of balance, which is a quiet mind, a calm heart, the ability to self-soothe, to calm my own anxiety. And that is a labor-intensive, lengthy process that is worth its weight in gold, because that leads to the third point of balance, which is the ability to have a grounded response, to not overreact, not play small, but to be calm. But being calm is something that, again, takes a tremendous amount of effort and time when you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person. And then that fourth point of balance is meaningful endurance, and this is all from the work of Dr. David Schnarch. But meaningful endurance, which involves increasing your tolerance of pain for growth by operating out of the best of yourself. So you're owning your own stuff rather than projecting your issues onto others, and then you're taking responsibility to change. This process of becoming differentiated, including that ability to self-soothe, to be grounded, it's a process that takes consistency, because it goes back to the whole path of awakening or becoming as well, where you didn't know this, you didn't know what you didn't know, and then you start to know and understand, but you're not doing it very regularly because it's not your home base that you're operating from. And eventually you'll do it more than you don't, and at some point you will become differentiated in not too long of a time. But when we're talking about trying to not react to a narcissist who knows the buttons to push because they're the person that you are most likely in this relationship that is closest to you, that they do know the buttons to push. And one of the challenging things as you are on this path of becoming differentiated is that part where we grow through discomfort. But is that growth that I am continuing to try to show up in this emotionally abusive or emotionally distant relationship, even though I'm learning how to be more grounded or learning who I am through it, that who I am is not who this person thinks I am. But there's also that body keeps the score vibe, where if my central nervous system is saying this is not safe, then I could try to become as grounded as I want to be, but then tell that to my body, tell that to the thing that has been trying to warn me and have me tap into my feelings for, it could be 10, 20, 30 years. And it may say, hey, we'll let you be grounded as you want to be and calm and collected outside of this relationship. But when you come in here, then your heart rate is going to elevate. You are going to slip back into this familiar territory of, okay, I got to protect myself. So if that's the case, then the discomfort is in following through with the boundary and setting boundaries and possibly getting out of this bad, toxic relationship. But here's the one that led to the quote that started today's episode, where they say, be empathetic. The exact part of the article says, be empathetic. If there is one way you can reach the mind of a narcissist, it is by empathy. You don't have to call them out or expose them. Instead, an empathic confrontation is an effective way to get a narcissist to listen to you, and is often used by therapists to treat people with narcissistic tendencies. And then in bold, develop a deep understanding of why they think a specific way and use this information to confront them about their behavior. Over a period, the narcissist may become receptive and obliged to visit a therapist or counselor for further treatment. Please do not do that. Do not use the information that you have learned trying to develop a deep understanding of why they think a specific way and then confront them about their behavior, because it will depend on what mask they put on, what buttons they can push, what stories they tell you. You will notice more of the inconsistencies, and then please do not confront them then about the behavior, because I have not seen a narcissist become receptive and then obliged to visit a therapist or a counselor for further treatment. To visit the therapist or the counselor to check a box so then they can say, see, I did it, now are you happy? And the therapist said that I was fine. Maybe, but it is not for further treatment to try to explore their narcissism. And I want to spend more time here because there are really some bigger problems if you are trying to use empathy with the narcissist. The narcissist will exploit the pathologically kind person's empathetic response and empathetic curiosity. And here's how. They will weaponize that vulnerability because a narcissist will often share carefully crafted stories of their past trauma or difficulties to elicit empathy. And they might exaggerate or fabricate the stories to create a sense of victimhood. That's one of the most common things that you see when the narcissist now has this gift of their partner's empathy. So when an empathetic person responds with compassion, the narcissist gains insight into their emotional triggers and their vulnerabilities. So an example might be a narcissist could say, my ex always criticized my career choices. So that's why I get defensive when we talk about my work. And that sets up a scenario where any future discussions about their career are off limits. So it's yet another way to protect them from accountability. And it also creates emotional debt. So by accepting empathy, narcissists create a sense of emotional debt. So they might later use this to manipulate the empathetic person, implying that since they were understanding before, the empathetic person now owes them. So the example might be, hey, I opened up to you about my insecurities. The least you could do is support my decision to quit my job without questioning me. Or they might use it to justify the bad behavior. A narcissist will use empathy that they receive as justification for their harmful actions. They'll twist the narrative, shockingly, to make their behavior seem pretty reasonable or a reasonable response to their struggles. So the example here might be, hey, you know how hard my childhood was. I told you about that. I opened up to you. So can you blame me for losing my temper sometimes? What am I supposed to do? Well, the answer is to work on your temper. And then the impact on the person who is trying to have empathy toward the narcissist, emotional exhaustion. Constantly providing empathy to somebody who doesn't reciprocate and whose story will change is emotionally draining. The empathetic person, they expend a significant amount of what I call emotional calories trying to understand and support the narcissist at the expense of their own well-being. They are in a position where they have sacrificed themselves to try and figure out how to meet the needs of the narcissist. And it is a never-ending battle. And it leads to self-doubt. It leads to blame. When empathy doesn't seem to improve a relationship, the empathetic person will internalize that because they are empathetic. They are pathologically kind. So then they will start to think, if I were more understanding or I expressed my empathy better, then things would improve. And so this whole self-blame cycle keeps them invested in a very dysfunctional relationship. So we can start to see, and I have more, but it is not only not a helpful or productive idea, it's a detrimental and it's a negative idea. It will also cause the person who is emotionally it will also cause the pathologically kind person to neglect their personal needs because in their efforts to be understanding, that empathetic person may consistently prioritize the narcissist's needs over their own because now the narcissist knows that the tool of empathy works. And then that can continue to lead to their loss of identity, their sense of self, neglect for personal boundaries, self-care. And one of the biggest problems is it provides ammunition because by sharing their own vulnerabilities and attempts to connect, the empathetic person inadvertently provides the narcissist with information that can and will be used for future manipulation or emotional abuse. And what it also does, which is so fascinating, is it reinforces the narcissist worldview because that constant view because constant empathy can reinforce the narcissist's sense of entitlement and their belief that their feelings and needs should always take precedence because they are not reciprocating. That's why earlier when we're talking about empathy can be good, but because I go back to the thought that empathy is a very positive trait in general, but it needs to be balanced with self-protection when dealing with the narcissist. And typically you will find reciprocity in a healthy relationship where there is empathy. So this cycle of the pathologically kind in this situation is that the empathetic person notices the narcissist's pain and now they offer understanding. And so far, that is what the article is suggesting is one of these simple ways to disarm the narcissist. So the narcissist accepts the empathy, but then they don't change their behavior. The empathetic person tries harder, thinking that their efforts weren't enough. Then the narcissist exploits this increased effort because now they have their attack surface. So they demand more understanding for their actions. and the empathetic person will feel guilty for not being kind enough and redoubles their efforts. And that cycle continues, with the empathetic person becoming increasingly drained and the narcissist behavior becoming more entrenched. So it wears down the pathologically kind person, and it gives the narcissist more supply and more fuel. So again, it is some of the worst advice I think that I personally could see in trying to engage with the narcissist. How do you break the cycle? Recognize that empathy alone cannot change a narcissist's behavior. Now instead, establish firm boundaries, not the ultimatums that are these things to say that we've talked about earlier. Prioritize self-care, self-compassion, raise that emotional baseline, and seek support from a therapist or a counselor who understands narcissistic abuse and realize that it's okay and necessary to actually withdraw empathy when it's being exploited. True empathy involves reciprocity. True empathy involves reciprocity. In a healthy relationship, both parties are able to give and receive empathy. And when this balance is consistently one-sided, it is not a demonstration of kindness, but it's a sign of an unhealthy dynamic that needs to be addressed. I feel like now I am emotionally drained, emotional calories spent. There are a few other of their simple tips and tricks, but hopefully the point has been made. Find information that you can trust, and if there are some things that maybe seem like you've heard them before in other narcissist podcasts or books or articles, I'm not saying that there can never be any new information, but if there are things that just don't feel right, that you've never heard anything like that before, like this person who wrote into me, which I'm so grateful for, where they just said, hey, this can't be correct, right? So thank you for sending that in, because it's not. So let's just go ahead and get to what have we learned today? Narcissism, while people use it very casually, it really is a small percentage of the people, but that emotional immaturity, though, it is everywhere. And these simple solutions are not that simple at all. For example, again, just staying calm or ignoring a narcissist might not only not work, but it could make things worse. And trying to use empathy with a narcissist will backfire. They will use your kindness against you. They will make you feel like you're always the problem, and you will feel drained and confused, always trying to figure out what you're doing wrong. And I just don't think it is ever helpful, productive, and I think it is even damaging to call ways of dealing with the narcissist simple. It's pretty complicated, and the adult human beings that are incredibly emotionally immature and narcissistic are in adult-sized bodies, and they say mean things, and they get intense. And so it is not a simple process. But I think if there is a biggest takeaway today is that dealing with narcissistic behavior is very difficult, and it can require professional help. It's not about finding quick fixes. There is no magic bullet or quick fix to this. It's more about understanding the situation, learning to start down this path of becoming differentiated, learning how to self-soothe and stay grounded, setting healthy boundaries. Self-care is not selfish. It's okay to prioritize your own mental health and well-being, which is not part of engaging with the narcissist. And if you're dealing with a narcissist, it's not your job to fix them. And it's certainly not your fault if they don't change. And the main thing is to truly have more patience with ourselves as we all work on trying to grow emotionally. And it's really important also to recognize when somebody's behavior is harmful or abusive, regardless of their level of emotional maturity, that that's not okay. And you have every right, and I give permission to take steps to protect yourself if necessary. All right, I would love to know your thoughts, your questions. Feel free to send them in. Share this with somebody if you think it will help. And have an amazing week, and I will see you next time on Waking Up to Narcissism.